Hey guys, tonight we're going to wander barefoot through ankle-deep medieval mud, squinting at soot-blackened thatch roofs in the fading light as smoke curls from hearths that never quite warm the bones. You're going to smell the sour tang of stale ale and hear the droning complaints of farmers sharpening scythes that double as weapons. You'll feel the itch of homespun wool on your skin and the dull ache in your back from endless stooping. And you're going to find out, up close, why, when these peasants finally snapped, they did so with such jaw-clenching, barn-burning violence. You probably won't survive this if you get in their way. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, I'd love to know, post your location and local time in the comments. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge across hard, rutted fields under a low gray sky. The soil here is stingy, stubborn clay, grabbing at the wooden plow like it wants to drag you under. Your lord says you owe him half the yield. The church demands its tithe, a holy 10% in theory. In practice, don't even try to argue with Father Guillaume about whether those extra fees are voluntary donations. You're constantly in debt. Last year's harvest failed after heavy rains rotted everything. Now you owe seed grain plus interest to the manor storehouse. That interest isn't in coin because you don't have any, it's in labor. Days working their fields instead of your own. Corvée labor is one of those charming medieval customs people forget about. You don't get paid. You're ordered to show up and repair roads, dig ditches, build your lord's new granary. If you refuse, you can be fined, more debt, or flogged, or both. There's something grimly funny in how bureaucratic all of this is. Your obligations are carefully recorded in Latin by a bored clerk who's better fed than you. He writes with fancy ink on parchment while you gnaw on hard bread crust and try not to cough too loud in case he notices you. Historians still argue whether these systems were really designed to keep order or just maintain an aristocracy that refused to work for its supper. Some claim feudal dues had a paternalistic logic. The lord protected you in exchange for labor. Others see a shakedown dressed in polite words. The mainstream fact is that feudalism was a system of mutual obligation. You got access to land, the lord promised defense from bandits or invaders. But defense often meant hiring thugs to keep you in line while he sipped wine in his hall. You lean on your hoe for a moment, watching the manor house in the distance. Whitewashed walls, wooden palisade, a couple of towers to spot trouble. Not that you'll ever be invited inside except maybe to beg forgiveness after failing to pay rent. Want a fun, weird tidbit? Some medieval peasants used dried animal dung for everything. Fuel, building filler, even medicine. Yes, really. Imagine slathering that on a wound and then trudging back into a field of mud and pig slop. Charming. Taxes come in all flavors. Grain, eggs, a piglet here, a goose there. Your wife tries to hide the fattest hen when the reeve comes around. He's not fooled. He writes it down. He always writes it down. Even in peacetime, you're preparing for war. Not glorious nightly tournaments. No, you're stockpiling beans against starvation. Repairing tools that double as weapons. If the lord raises taxes again, you might have to choose between feeding your children and keeping your nose unbroken. Your house is one room, smoky from the hearth. The roof leaks, the floor is packed earth. You sleep on straw crawling with fleas. The whole family together. Privacy is a concept for monks and nobles. A neighbor limps over, complaining that the miller takes too much. Lords often own the mill and bakehouse and peasants have to use them. That's more tax, more fees. A good racket, honestly. If the modern world did this, we'd call it a monopoly. Back then, they just called it Thursday. As dusk falls, you look at your children's sunburned faces. They're already old before their time, helping in the fields as soon as they can walk. If they survive the next winter, that is. Famine is a regular visitor, always hungry for new bodies. You sigh and wipe your forehead. At least tonight you have food. Some barley bread, weak ale, a turnip stew. No meat unless something died unexpectedly. Well, you did see a rat in the grain bin. This is the backdrop for the rage to come. You're not born a rebel, you're born desperate and made furious. Every season you hope for a good harvest and fair treatment. Every season you're disappointed. Your Lord Steward once told you taxes were for your own good. You asked if he'd like to pay them for you. He didn't laugh. He did threaten to double your dues for insolence. Sometimes there's a whisper of change, a royal decree about fair rents. Don't get too excited. The local lord interprets that however he likes. You can appeal to the king if you can afford the trip and survive the return. And sure, there's justice. Manor courts decide disputes, usually in favor of whoever owns the manor. You once got fined for stealing firewood off your own scrap of land, because the lord claimed rights to all the trees. It's funny in a tragic way. Your entire village knows how rigged it is, yet you're expected to kneel and scrape and say thank you for the privilege of being bled dry. You're dirty, tired, and not particularly loyal. You know who's coming first if there's trouble: the tax collector, the soldiers, the priest reminding you that defying your lord is defying God. Your only real power? Numbers. And even that's a gamble. If enough of you rise up, you might win a concession or two, or you might get your village burned to the ground. But let's not rush ahead. For now, you stand in the twilight, leaning on your hoe, glaring at the manor house. The wind smells like manure. Somewhere a dog barks, and you wonder how long you can keep paying for the right to starve on your own land. You shuffle home in the dusk, scowling at the manor on the hill, knowing exactly who really owns you. The Lord might not know your children's names, but he knows exactly how much you owe him, to the last egg. He controls the land, not just the broad fields stretching out like a dull brown sea, but the tiny patch you call yours. It's yours only so long as you keep paying and obeying. Miss a payment? He can kick you off without even looking up from his goblet. You see him sometimes on his horse, trotting through the village. He wears fine wool, dyed in expensive shades that announce he's important. He has a sword at his hip even though he hasn't used it in years except to carve roast boar. He might wave politely. That's the joke. A little show of lordly benevolence. But if you actually ask him to lower rents, he'll frown like you farted in church. Justice is in his hands too. He runs the manor court. Complain about your neighbor stealing your goose? He might listen if you're in favor. But if you accuse his reeve of overcharging for the mill, don't waste your breath. Historians still argue whether these local courts were genuine attempts at fairness or just a way to keep peasants subservient. Some say they offered needed conflict resolution in an era without state policing. Others see them as kangaroo courts in fine medieval style. You know which version you believe. Punishments can be absurdly harsh. A small theft might mean branding, stocks, fines so big you lose your land. And let's not forget execution if you really tick off your lord. He has gallows for a reason. You remember the last time someone tried to defy him. Old Bertrand refused to pay extra after the harvest failed. The steward made an example of him. They seized his cow, his tools, even the straw from his roof. His children scattered to beg in other villages. And the Lord? He feasted that week. Roast meats, musicians brought in from town, candles made from real beeswax. Your entire annual rent would buy a single night's wine bill for his table. There's something bleakly comedic in the paperwork, too. All these transactions recorded in beautiful calligraphy, bound in leather. As if the prettier the record, the less cruel the debt. And he doesn't just want your money, he wants your time. Corvée labor. Military service, if he calls it. When the kingdom's at war, which is often, you might get conscripted with little more than a pitchfork and a prayer. He decides the rules. The forest? It's his. You can't hunt there without permission, even if deer stroll past your starving children. Cut firewood without leave? That's theft. Even gathering fallen branches can get you fined. One of your friends once tried to trap rabbits on lordly land. The bailiff caught him. He spent a week in the stocks, sunburned, jeered at by neighbors who were forced to watch. Want a weird detail? Some lords charged marriage fees. If your daughter married without permission, you paid a fine. Want your own wedding blessed? More fees. Even love was taxable. He also controlled the village mill and oven. You were required to use them, paying extra for the privilege. Bake your own bread in a personal oven? Illegal, because the Lord might miss out on that sweet, sweet surcharge. Some historians argue that these obligations were simply the price of stability. Lords maintained roads, defended against raiders, provided a kind of order. Others roll their eyes and call it legalized extortion with a nice coat of chivalric paint. You snort at the idea of protection. The last time bandits raided, the Lord barricaded himself in his manor. You and your neighbors fought them off with scythes and axes while he watched from the tower. If you complained, he'd remind you it was his land, that you were his people, and that being his meant doing what you were told. You lie awake some nights listening to the wind rattle the shutters. You imagine storming that manor, tearing up the records, grabbing his fine silver and flinging it in the mud. But you don't, because you're afraid, because you have kids to feed, because if you fail, the punishment will be legendary. Yet the resentment seeps in like rain through a thatched roof. One bad harvest, one extra tax, one insult from a steward too big for his boots. That's all it takes. You remember a joke someone told at the tavern. Why does the Lord love taxes? Because his belly's too full for work. You all laughed quietly, watching the door to make sure no one was listening. You've seen the Lord's men beat someone for less. And the Lord himself? He'll speak of divine order. He'll tell you God chose him to rule. He'll pay priests to say so from the pulpit. You're not just disobedient. If you resist, you're damned. Historians still debate if peasants really believed this. Did they truly think God wanted them poor and obedient? Or did they nod along while planning revolt in the dark corners of their hovels? You suspect the answer is both. The worst part? You can't leave. Legally, you're bound to the land. Serfdom isn't quite slavery, but it rhymes. You owe service, rent, obedience. And you can't just walk away without permission. Sure, some try. Runaways, vagabonds. If caught, they're dragged back and punished. And if they disappear for a year and a day without getting caught, maybe they get freedom. But who can hide that long with no food, no friends, willing to risk helping? So you stay, you work, you pay, you bow, because that's safer. For now. The Lord's manor glows in the distance, candles in every window, laughter echoing faintly in the still night. You hunch your shoulders, pull your patched cloak tighter, and head home to your single smoky room. Your stomach growls. Tomorrow you'll do it all again. But tomorrow you might grumble a little louder. Tomorrow someone might say enough. Tomorrow the village might find its courage, and the Lord will discover his grip isn't quite as strong as he thinks. You wake to the sound of church bells tolling in the gray dawn, muffled by the morning fog. You roll off your straw mattress, brush off a couple of fleas, and groan at the idea of another day of labor you don't own. But first, the spiritual part. You trudge toward the small stone church at the edge of the village. It's crooked from centuries of settling, and the walls are whitewashed, flaking like old skin. A single stained glass window shows a saint with wide, judging eyes that seem to follow you. You push through the door into chill, damp air. It always smells of tallow candles and wet wool. The priest drones in Latin that you don't understand. You catch a few words you recognize, but he might as well be chanting to keep demons away. You stand with your neighbors, heads bowed. Everyone's here, because if you skip Mass, the priest will notice. He'll mention it pointedly next Sunday. He might even visit your hut to talk about the dangers of sloth. He also collects the tithe. 10% of everything you harvest, in theory. In practice, he rounds up. If your yield was poor, too bad. Pay anyway. You try not to roll your eyes as he preaches charity. Charity means you give. He just collects. Historians still argue whether the medieval church was a stabilizing moral force or simply another landlord in robes. Some see it as the glue holding society together. Others see it as the biggest extortion scheme of the Middle Ages. You know which side you're on this morning. Your kids fidget beside you. They're too young to understand the words, but they understand the tone. Fear. Obedience. That's half the point. The priest is the Lord's ally. He tells you that rebellion is a sin, that God loves a humble, obedient heart. He doesn't mention that God seems to love wealthy monasteries even more. You once asked the priest why the abbey has silver candlesticks while you can't afford a candle at home. He fixed you with those wide, judging eyes and asked if you were envious. Envy, he reminded you, is a deadly sin. But paying him isn't. It's funny in a bleak way. If you're late with your tithe, he'll threaten excommunication. That's terrifying. It means no sacraments, no burial in hallowed ground, eternal damnation. You think about that every time you bury a child. Small graves dot the edge of the churchyard. No headstones, just little mounds, marked with a cross if you can whittle one. The priest says they're with God now, but he still insists you pay your dues for the living. Want a weird tidbit? Some churches stored relics that were questionably authentic. One local parish claims to have a feather from the Archangel Gabriel. You suspect it came from the local goose. But you don't say that out loud. He also polices your morals. That's not just theory. He knows who drinks too much, who argues with their spouse, who breaks fasting rules. He'll make you confess publicly if you're caught. It's a form of control, not just over your body, but your mind. You learn to police yourself, to feel guilt for even thinking about standing up to your Lord. And the church isn't just the village priest. Monasteries own land too, often huge tracts. They rent it out. They demand the same dues as any secular lord. Sometimes worse, because they claim God's blessing makes their demands even more righteous. You pass one of those monastery fields sometimes, neatly fenced, well plowed by serfs who don't dare complain because the abbot has connections all the way to the bishop. Historians still debate whether monastic landlords were better or worse than lay nobles. Some say they were more charitable. Others point out that charity often meant alms so tiny they didn't replace what was extracted in rents and labor. You see the priest leaving Mass with a satisfied smile. He'll visit the sick today, make sure they confess before they die. Important business. Can't have souls slipping away unpaid for. You mutter that joke under your breath. Your neighbor snorts. You both glance around to make sure no one heard. Last time someone made a crack about the priest's side hustle selling indulgences, they did penance on their knees in the cold. He comes to your house sometimes. Not to eat, you can't afford to offer more than thin stew. He comes to check your moral state, to see if you're harboring sinful thoughts. You nod and lie. He believes you, mostly. Or maybe he just doesn't care, so long as the tithe comes on time. The funny part is, you want to believe. You want there to be justice after this life, because there sure isn't much here. You remember last Easter? The priest preached about the meek inheriting the earth. Then he blessed the new grain store built with forced labor. You try not to laugh at the hypocrisy, or cry at it. Your children ask if the priest is a good man. You pause. You say he tries to help. Because what else can you tell them? That everyone in power here has sharp teeth behind gentle words? You pass the church on your way home, looking back at its leaning tower. The bell tolls again. A reminder. You're supposed to be grateful for salvation, even if it costs everything you have. But gratitude runs dry when your belly is empty. So you clutch your bag of barley tighter, counting the 10th you'll have to hand over, even though it means one fewer meal for your kids. And you wonder how long people will keep paying for salvation they can't taste or touch. Because someday, someone's going to refuse. Someday the bells will toll, not for Mass, but for revolt. You step carefully through the muck of the village lane, the smell of damp earth mixed with smoke from last night's hearth. Your stomach growls, even though you've already eaten what passes for breakfast. Thin porridge, mostly water, a single onion shared among the children like it's a royal treat. You're used to hunger. Everyone is. But this year is worse. The spring was too wet, the fields flooded, and what didn't drown molded in the ground. Last autumn you tried to store grain in the communal granary, but rats took their share, and then the Lord Steward took the rest for taxes in advance. Now you watch your neighbor's kids with hollow eyes, cheeks sunken, hair brittle from malnutrition. It's not some dramatic one-day famine that sweeps in with a flourish. It's slow, crawling misery. A hunger that lives in your bones. You remember the priest saying suffering makes you holy. You wanted to ask if holiness fills your belly, but you didn't. You're not that brave. Historians still argue whether famines were truly inevitable acts of God or human-made disasters. Sure, the weather can't be controlled, but hoarding, poor planning, and taxes that ignored reality turned a bad harvest into a catastrophe. Your lord, of course, still eats well. You see the castle kitchen sending out stew in big copper pots to the guards. Smells amazing. You'd give your left arm for a single mouthful. But you're not invited. Instead, you scrape at the soil with a broken hoe, planting beans you hope will sprout in this cold, wet ground. And then there's plague. You remember the last time it came through. It wasn't the big, dramatic Black Death this time, just one of the many visitations that seem to show up every decade or so, like a particularly aggressive tax collector. Your neighbor coughed blood for 3 days before dying. You helped bury him with a kerchief over your mouth, though no one really thought it helped. The priest said it was punishment for sins. You weren't sure whose sins exactly. Everyone was poor, hungry, miserable, and terrified. Want a weird detail? Some folks believed disease was spread by bad air, miasma. They'd hang herbs, burn dung, yes, again with the dung, and carry pomanders of spices. Did it work? Well, it made things smell less like rotting bodies. That's something. You remember sitting by your child's side, wiping their feverish brow, praying they'd survive. This time they did, but you've buried another before. Small bundle, too light in your arms. You don't talk about it much. No one does, but everyone remembers. You see it in the lines on your neighbors' faces, and even in plague years, you still owe labor. That's the cruelest part. Corvée doesn't stop because you're dying. The Lord needs his roads repaired, his moat cleared of silt, his new barn raised. You show up because you have to. The steward counts heads, notes who's missing. Those too sick to work? They'll owe extra next season. And if you argue, there's punishment. Stocks, fines, beatings. One old man in your village refused, said he'd rather die than dig ditches for free while his own field went to weeds. They dragged him before the manor court. The Lord mercifully reduced his punishment from whipping to double rent. He lost his land within a year. Historians still debate whether corvée was an unavoidable necessity in a labor-poor economy or a deliberate form of exploitation. Maybe it was both. You don't care. You just know you hate it. Because while you're out digging the Lord's new fish pond, your own children are sowing the field alone, too young to do it properly. You know it means another bad harvest. More hunger, more deaths. It's a cycle that grinds you down. You joke about it sometimes, dark humor to keep from crying. What's worse than the plague, you ask? Paying rent on the grave, someone answers. It's not really funny. But you laugh, because otherwise you'd scream. The worst days are the ones when the steward comes with his list. He reads it in that slow, pompous voice, enjoying the way you flinch when he calls your name. 4 days of labor on the mill dam, 2 on the new granary, and don't forget the extra for missing last season's repair work. You nod. You don't argue, because you saw what happened to the last one who did. You remember how they paraded him through the village with his hands tied, face bloodied from the beating. You tell yourself you're smarter, that you'll survive, but inside you're seething, and you're not alone. You see it in the sideways glances, the muttered curses, when the steward's back is turned. Want another fun tidbit? Some places had a death tax. When you died, the Lord claimed your best animal or other valuable. Even death couldn't free you from owing something. It's one last insult, one final payment. Your children know all this. They see you come home limping from forced labor. They hear you curse when the rats get into the dwindling grain. They see you bury your pride with every bow to the steward. And they're learning. Learning that fairness isn't real here. Learning that someday, someone might have to stop bowing. But not yet. Because today, there's work to be done. You shoulder your hoe. Look at the sickly field. Try to forget the smell of death that still haunts you from last season. And wonder if this will be the year someone says, enough. You lean on your hoe, eyes flicking down the dirt road that slices through your village. It's quiet now, but you know it's a thoroughfare for more than just livestock and carts loaded with grain for the Lord's granary. It's also the main route for gossip, rumor, and news. News here isn't printed or official. It's shouted by travelers, whispered by merchants, sung by balladeers half drunk on bad wine. Information moves like wildfire if the wind is right. And in these miserable times, the right rumor is as dangerous as any sword. You remember the first time someone mentioned a rebellion in another county. A tinker passing through muttered it over ale at the tavern, voice low but eyes bright with mischief. He said peasants had risen up, burned records, and driven their lord into the woods like a frightened deer. The entire room fell silent, until someone laughed it off. Said the tinker was a liar, a drunk. That no one could really do that. But you remember how no one forgot the story. It stayed in the back of your mind as you plowed stubborn, rocky soil and dreamed of your lord running barefoot, screaming for mercy. Historians still argue whether these traveling storytellers really meant to incite rebellion or just liked stirring the pot. Some see them as proto-revolutionaries. Others think they were just making a living on tall tales. You don't know their motives, you just know the effect. Because the next time the tinker passed through, he said the revolt had grown. That now it was whole villages marching with scythes and torches. You watched your neighbors' faces carefully. Their expressions didn't say impossible anymore. They said maybe. It wasn't just tinkers. It was preachers too. Charismatic, half-starved men in patched robes, waving scripture, crying out against injustice. They'd gather a crowd in the square and thunder about how God didn't want his children to starve while the fat lords feasted. You remember one in particular? Lean and wild-eyed, quoting Isaiah about breaking the chains of oppression. The steward tried to chase him off, but the crowd blocked his way. He left before soldiers could be summoned, but not before his words burrowed into everyone's ears like fleas. Want a weird detail? Some of these preachers claimed divine visions told them to rebel. Others just had magnificent beards that seemed to add moral authority. Honestly, you half thought of growing one yourself, just for the effect. Word spread faster than the plague, because you wanted to hear it. You wanted to know that somewhere, someone was fighting back, that lords were afraid, that castles burned. You repeated these stories at night over guttering candles, voice hushed so your children wouldn't wake up. Your spouse told you to hush, terrified the walls had ears. But you kept talking, because talking was safer than doing. For now, and the rumors weren't always true. You heard one about an entire region declaring independence, forming councils of peasants who voted on everything. Turned out they were crushed within a month. The survivors hanged along the road as a warning. You tried to forget that version. You preferred the one where they won. Historians still debate how much these rumors actually fueled revolts, or if they were just symptoms of an already boiling rage. Some argue they offered hope. Others say they offered dangerous illusions. You suspect both are true, because hope and illusion often hold hands. You remember one winter night, crowded into the tavern for warmth, everyone trading news like cards. Someone claimed the king himself had declared that taxes were too high, that peasants should be treated fairly. You laughed bitterly. So did everyone else. The king might say that in a charter, but here, the Lord interpreted it his own way, usually as pay me more for the privilege of ignoring royal decrees. But even cynical laughter felt better than silence, because silence was surrender. You remember how careful you had to be about who you told these stories to. The reeve had ears. The priest liked to remind people that sedition was a sin. Confess your rebellious thoughts and do your penance, or risk hell. Some people took that seriously. Others just nodded and kept plotting. You had to guess who was who. One time you misjudged. You joked about torching the manor house in front of the wrong person. The steward visited you the next day. You still have the scar on your ribs from that beating. Afterward, you didn't speak so freely. But you didn't stop thinking. Because thinking was harder to punish, and the rumors kept coming. about taxes tripled in the next county, about lords running away, about royal messengers torn apart by angry crowds. You remembered every detail. You noticed your neighbors did too. Want to laugh? Some of the rumors were absurd. Lords dressing as peasants to escape, tripping over their own silk hose, priests throwing off their robes to join rebels. Probably nonsense. But it felt good to imagine. Because imagining was step one. And if you could imagine it, you might just try it. You knew that was dangerous thinking. But once you heard it, you couldn't unhear it. You worked the fields with those stories in your head, sweating under the sun, muscles screaming, stomach empty. You looked at your hoe, your sickle, your pitchfork, and saw not just tools, but weapons. You saw the steward's face twisted in fear instead of contempt. You saw the manor house in flames, the records turned to ash. You saw freedom, even if you didn't know what that would really look like. You spat in the dirt, wiped your mouth, and got back to work. Because for now, that's all you could do. But you knew something had changed. The village was restless. People talked in twos and threes instead of crowds, glancing over shoulders, lowering voices. The steward noticed, of course. He scolded you all for sedition, threatened harsher punishments. But the more he threatened, the more you resented. Because every threat proved the stories right. They were afraid. And fear was contagious too. You saw it in the way the reeve stuttered when announcing new taxes, the way the priest added more sermons about obedience. You didn't say anything. But inside you smiled, because you knew a rumor is just a spark. And all around you the dry kindling was piled high. Waiting, you stand in your tiny yard, staring at your tools lined up against the wall. A hoe with a cracked handle, a sickle, its curve chipped from years of harvest, a sturdy pitchfork, prongs bent but serviceable. They're not weapons. Not yet. But you think about it more than you should. You pick up the hoe. Feel the weight. It's awkward, but it can crush a skull with enough force. The sickle is sharp enough to open throats, though you've only ever used it to cut barley. The pitchfork, a spear in everything but name. You glance around. No one watching. You test a thrust. Stiff, clumsy, but it could kill. You lower it quickly, heart thudding, because this is dangerous thinking. But you're not alone. Everyone in the village knows these tools can be repurposed. After all, you can't exactly buy swords at the market. The blacksmith might make you one, but only if he's suicidal or you're very persuasive. So you make do. Historians still argue whether peasant revolts were well-organized military campaigns or desperate mobs with farming equipment. Some point to careful planning and sieges. Others see raw fury with no strategy. You suspect it was both. You've heard the stories from other villages. When they finally rose, they brought everything. Hoes, scythes with blades lengthened and mounted on poles, mallets, hammers, even kitchen knives lashed to sticks. Improvised? Sure, but lethal. Want a weird detail? Some rebels even stuffed their shirts with straw or leather to make armor. Not very effective, but it felt braver. It's hard to feel fear when you're basically dressed as a human scarecrow. You remember one of the older men bragging he once used a flail meant for threshing grain to break a steward's arm. Said it swung beautifully, though he didn't recommend it for close quarters. You chuckled at the time. But you remembered. Because you've practiced too. Quietly, in the backfield when no one was around. You tried the swing of your sickle, the thrust of the pitchfork. Imagine the steward's sneer replaced with terror. You're not a soldier. You know that. But you're strong. Years of labor have given you arms like knotted rope. You know the land better than any knight. You can move quiet as a cat through the hedgerows, avoid the Lord's patrols, set an ambush with nothing more than a whistle to your neighbors. You know the steward underestimates you. That's the first advantage. They think you're stupid. You remember watching the blacksmith hammering nails and thinking how they'd work nicely in a cudgel, or how a plow blade could be reshaped if someone dared. He doesn't dare, yet, but the day might come. And the Lord's men? They have swords, sure, armor sometimes, but they don't know your fields like you do. They don't know which ditch floods in rain, which path turns to sucking mud. You do. You could lead them in circles until they're exhausted, then hit them with pitchforks from the darkness. It's not noble, but it's war. You remember joking with your spouse that you'd tie kitchen pots to your body for armor. They didn't laugh. They just shook their head, eyes scared. You didn't bring it up again, because it stopped being funny. Want another quirky bit? In some places, peasants made slings from woven wool or flax. Simple, cheap, effective. Nothing like the elegant crossbows lords might buy, but good enough to crack a skull or keep soldiers' heads down. You know who's good with a sling? Kids. You hate the thought, but you've seen your eldest practicing, and you didn't tell them to stop, because you don't know if you might need that skill. Historians still debate how much these homemade arsenals mattered. Some claim they were laughable against real soldiers. Others point to entire companies of rebels who fought off trained men for weeks. You suspect truth lies somewhere in between. Because rage adds weight to any blow, and numbers help. Your village is small, but there are dozens like it nearby. If everyone rose at once, that's the dream. But it's also the fear. Because the Lord knows this too. That's why he bans gatherings, watches travelers, questions anyone coming from town. He knows what these rumors do. He knows what practice swings in the field mean. He's afraid, and fear breeds cruelty. You see it already. Extra patrols, harsher punishments for theft or insult. The Stewards Club used more freely. They're sending a message, but you're getting messages too. A tinker tells you he saw a village where they sharpened their sickles until they glinted like mirrors. A preacher says God has no use for lords who starve his flock. A passing carter claims they hanged their steward from his own grain hook. You listen. You remember. And you wait. Because while you use these tools to feed your family, you know you might one day use them to free them. You squat in the dirt, turning your sickle over in your hands. The edge is dull. You'll need to sharpen it anyway for harvest. Might as well be ready. You glance at the road again. Quiet, for now. But you know it won't stay that way. Because every cracked hoe, every bent pitchfork, every rust-flecked sickle is a promise. A promise that if pushed too far, you won't die quietly. You'll take someone with you. And maybe, just maybe, you'll win. Even if you don't survive to see it. You stand in the village square at dusk, watching the last streaks of sun slip behind the trees. The talk today wasn't about harvest or taxes, it was about fire. Not the comforting hearth, not the oven-warming barley bread, the kind of fire that consumes everything. Your neighbor leaned in close, voice trembling, and told you what he'd heard from a carter passing through. They burned it, burned the whole manor to the ground. You felt your heart skip, not in fear, but something like hope. Because you know what that means. No manor house, no records. No records means no debts, no proof you owe anything. You can practically see the steward's face, pale as curdled milk, watching his precious ledgers curl and blacken in the flames. Historians still argue whether these burnings were planned revolutionary acts or sheer rage. Some say peasants targeted archives on purpose to erase obligations. Others think it was simple revenge. If you're going to torch a house, might as well torch the records. You suspect both are true. You remember the feel of parchment. The steward showing you your debt with delicate fingers, smirking as he read the Latin words you couldn't understand. See? It's official. You imagine that same page curling to ash. You almost smile. Of course, burning a manor house isn't easy. Stone doesn't burn. But the roof? Thatched, dry, perfect for catching. Wooden doors, floors, beams, kindling. And if you bar the doors first, you might trap the Lord inside. Not that you think about that too hard, or admit it out loud. You heard the tale of one village that waited until the Lord left for business. They gathered quietly at dusk, men and women both. They carried torches wrapped in oil-soaked rags. They didn't cheer, didn't chant. They just walked up the hill, lit the thatch, and stood back to watch it burn. Silent. Like a funeral. Except this time, they buried the old order. Want a weird tidbit? In some places, rebels rang the village bells as they torched the manor. Not to warn people, but as a signal. The time had come. It must have sounded like Judgment Day. You imagine standing there, bell clanging in the cold night, flames turning the sky orange, the wind throwing sparks across the fields. You're finally free to keep for yourself. You're not proud of that thought, but you don't hate it either. You know the risks. If the Lord escapes, he'll bring soldiers. If the king hears, he'll send his justice. Burning a manor isn't a crime. It's a declaration of war. Historians still debate how much these burnings actually hurt the feudal system. Some argue they were temporary setbacks. Lords rebuilt, records recreated, punishments enforced. Others say they were vital blows that weakened the whole structure, showing the world peasants wouldn't stay passive. You don't think in grand theories. You think in debts erased. You think in fear gone. You remember one old woman muttering that it's the only way to get the rats to scatter, burn the granary. You laughed at that. Dark humor keeps you sane. You heard another story, this one even more dramatic. A manor set alight while the Lord was inside. Some say he begged at the door, promised lower rents, promised forgiveness. They didn't open it. You shudder at that, because you know that's a line. But you also know they probably remembered every beating, every child buried because there wasn't enough food after taxes, every lash from the steward's whip. And in that moment, no one felt like a sinner. They felt like judges. You look at your own manor in the distance. Stone walls catching the last light, smoke from the hearth curling lazily into the darkening sky. You think about what's inside. Records of who owes what. Lists of corvée labor. Notes on fines for gathering fallen branches. Your life written in someone else's words. You imagine it burning, ash drifting over your fields like gray snow. No more debt, no more steward. Just you, your family, and the land. You know it wouldn't be that simple. The Lord has allies, other nobles, even the church. The priest would call it sacrilege. God's order, he'd say. You'd remind him God doesn't live in that manor. He'd tell you rebellion is a sin. You'd ask if starvation is holy. You know that conversation wouldn't end well. But you've had it in your head a dozen times. Want another laugh? Someone once suggested they burn the manor and roast the steward over the coals like a pig. It was a joke. Sort of. No one really wanted that. Probably. But the image lingered, because fear turns to hate. And hate is hungry. You notice your hands are shaking. You hide them. You don't want anyone to see that you're even thinking about this, because thinking about it is step one. And you don't know if you're ready for step two. But you know others are. You see them talking quietly in the tavern. See how they look at the manor when they think no one's watching. The steward notices too. That's why there are more patrols, more punishments, more sermons about obedience, because they know what you're all thinking. They know fire is coming, and they're afraid. Almost as afraid as you are. But fear doesn't stop the wind from blowing, or the rumors from spreading, or the dry thatch from catching when someone finally strikes the match. You take one last look at the manor, then turn away, for now. Because even if you don't light it, you know someone will. And when it burns, the whole world will change with it. You remember the day they finally stopped whispering and started organizing. It didn't happen in some grand hall or solemn council. It was the tavern, smoky and cramped, with everyone pretending they were just there for ale. But the real business was planning. How many men could fight? Who had the strongest arms? Who had a cart that could carry supplies? It felt absurd at first. You weren't soldiers, you were farmers. You bent over maps drawn in charcoal on scraps of wood. Argued over which road was best to block. Laughed grimly when someone suggested charging the Lord's knights head-on. You weren't that suicidal. Instead, you planned ambushes in hedgerows you'd planted yourselves. You knew every hidden path, every swampy patch that turned horses into floundering beasts. You shared tips about turning tools into weapons, remembered from that night you all practiced alone in the fields. Want a weird detail? Some groups elected captains, who had zero military experience but impressive beards. Beards seemed to be a qualification for leadership back then. And you knew you weren't alone. Word came of other villages doing the same. Whole regions rising, meeting in secret clearings lit by moonlight. A patchwork army. Historians still argue whether these were armies in any formal sense or just mobs. Some insist they had chains of command and set goals. Others say they fell apart at the first sight of professional soldiers. You think both can be true, because you remember the first real skirmish. It wasn't a grand battle on open fields. It was an ambush. You and 24 others crouched behind hedges at dawn, waiting for the steward's men sent to restore order. They were smug. They didn't even expect resistance, which made it easy. When you jumped out, pitchforks and clubs swinging, they panicked. Some ran. Some fought badly. A few you had to kill. You try not to remember those faces, because they were like you. Poor, hungry, just on the wrong side of the Lord's favor. But you didn't have time for guilt, because you won. You still hear the cheer that went up, a ragged, desperate sound, the sound of people realizing they could fight back. You stripped their weapons. Not fancy, clubs, old swords, a couple of rusty helmets, but better than nothing. You distributed them as fairly as you could, because you had to keep going. You couldn't just win once. You had to keep winning. So you drilled, not like knights with banners flapping and lances gleaming. You drilled in muddy fields, counting steps, practicing thrusts, learning not to swing wildly and overbalance. It wasn't elegant, but it worked. You got faster, meaner, and you learned tactics. Block roads with felled trees, flood the ditch to bog down cavalry, draw soldiers in with a feigned retreat, then hit them from the sides. You became students of your own land, because that was your advantage. You remember the first time you faced knights. That was different. They came in armor that gleamed even in the overcast light. They had real weapons, real training. Your heart hammered in your chest like it wanted out. But you didn't run. You scattered into the woods, led them on a merry chase, then doubled back to torch their supply cart. They had to retreat, cursing you as cowards. You didn't mind, because you didn't want to fight them straight up. You wanted them hungry, cold, lost. You wanted them gone. Historians still debate how effective these peasant armies really were. Some call them dangerous and disciplined enough to negotiate concessions. Others think they were doomed to fail the moment real nobles united against them. You remember the victories, but you remember the defeats too. The village that tried to hold the bridge against trained men and got slaughtered. The captain who insisted on a glorious charge and died with half his followers in a muddy ditch. You learned from those mistakes. No more heroics, just survival. You think about those meetings in barns late at night, arguments hissing in the dark. Do we negotiate? Fight? Flee? Your voice was hoarse from shouting your ideas. Your spouse begged you to stop. You couldn't, because it was your life on the line, your children's future. You couldn't leave that to others. Want another quirky bit? Some peasant banners were literally sackcloth with crude symbols, hoes, sheaves of wheat, or angry faces drawn in charcoal. Not exactly regal, but no one doubted their meaning. You carried one once, felt foolish at first, but when you saw your neighbors rally behind it, it didn't feel so foolish. It felt like hope. Even if that hope was held together with twine and rage, and sometimes you did negotiate. After a victory, you'd send word to the Lord. Lower the taxes, free the prisoners, end the corvée. Sometimes he agreed, more often he lied. You learned not to trust treaties scrawled in the middle of the night, because the ink was barely dry before soldiers arrived. Still, you kept fighting, because you didn't have a choice. It was either win or go back to bowing. And you'd seen too much to ever bow again without thinking of fire. You'd heard too many stories, told too many yourself. You'd seen what your pitchfork could do. You'd felt the strength in your own calloused hands. You'd learned that fear cuts both ways. You hear someone laugh in the tavern, joking that your army is the worst dressed in history. You laugh too, because it's true. But you're the only army you have, and for the first time you feel like it might be enough. You sit by the embers of the hearth, listening to the quiet crackle of dying flame. Outside, the wind moans through the gaps in the shutter. You're not sleeping tonight, because you're waiting for hoofbeats. You heard they're coming. The Lord didn't take the last uprising kindly. He barely escaped when they burned his records. He lost taxes for the year, lost respect among his peers. He's not going to let that stand. He sent messengers to neighboring lords, promised favors, promised debts forgiven. In return, soldiers, mercenaries even, hard-eyed men who fight for coin, not for loyalty. And they're coming here. You heard the tinker say they're riding through the next village even now. And you know what that means. It means no negotiations. It means punishment. Historians still argue whether noble reprisals were meant as deterrence or sheer revenge. Some say they had to be harsh to prevent total collapse of order. Others see it as naked cruelty meant to crush the spirit of anyone who dared stand up. You have an opinion on that, because you've seen what order looks like. You remember the last time. They didn't just hang the leaders, they burned the homes, fields too, if they felt especially thorough, salted the ground in places. You can't grow hope in salted earth. You remember how they lined people up and made them watch, made you watch, so you wouldn't forget. You didn't. Want a weird detail? Some nobles carried justice banners when they did reprisals, claiming it was all legal and God approved. A big flag apparently made murder okay. You still see that banner in nightmares. The men who held it laughed as they dragged people out. They called it pacification. You called it slaughter. You heard they once hanged 50 in a single day, along the road so the bodies swung in the wind for anyone traveling by. You didn't need directions. You could follow the smell. You remember your children crying. You remember telling them to look away. You remember not being able to. You know they're coming again. That's why you're sitting here sharpening the sickle, even though you know it's pointless against armor. Because you'd rather die swinging than kneeling. You're not the only one. Your neighbor's board shutters. The blacksmith packs what he can. Others flee into the woods with children on their backs. Some stay, not because they're brave, because they're too tired to run, too angry to leave their homes behind. You know, the Lord will say you forced his hand, that rebellion had to be punished, that it's your fault, because you forgot your place. Historians still debate whether these reprisals truly broke the spirit of the peasantry or only sowed seeds for future revolt. Some say fear worked, others say every burning village was a promise of the next uprising. You're not sure, but you know you're not scared enough to stop hating them. You remember one old man refusing to bow as they tied the rope around his neck, spat in the reeve's face. They beat him before they hanged him. You think about him a lot, especially on nights like this. You hear someone joke that at least the soldiers will be warm tonight. They'll have your house to burn. You laugh, but it's the kind of laugh that leaves splinters in your throat. You know they'll take livestock, food, anything of value. They'll say it's payment for the trouble you caused, like a thief calling himself a tax collector. You've seen soldiers knock over cradles looking for hidden coins. You've seen them drag women away. You don't want to think about that part, but you do, because you have a wife, because you have daughters, because you know what happens when men with weapons know there will be no punishment. Want another grim laugh? They'll write it all down, in beautiful script, with seals and ribbons, proof it was all legal. God's justice, signed and sealed. You don't have parchment, just mud and blood. You hear someone in the tavern say maybe if you all beg, they'll go easier. You see the look in his eyes. He doesn't believe it, neither do you. Because you know the point isn't to be fair. The point is to be terrifying, to make sure you remember your place. You remember last time the priest blessed the soldiers before they left to punish you, told them they were doing God's work. You didn't go to Mass for months after that. You still don't. Because you don't think God lives in that church anymore. You think he left when the roof caught fire. Maybe he ran with the rest of you into the woods. You don't know if you'll run this time. You want to. But you also want to fight. You want to see the steward's face if you get just one good swing. You want them to know you didn't kneel, that you didn't forget, because they want you to forget. That's the point of making you watch, of making you listen to your neighbors scream, of making you bury bodies in ground you can't even call your own. But you remember. You'll always remember. You set down the sickle. Look at your family huddled by the hearth. Wonder if they'll forgive you for not stopping this before it started. Wonder if they'll forgive you for what you might have to do next. You listen for hoofbeats and wait, because you know they're coming. And you know this isn't over, not by a long shot. You sit in the smoky hush of the church, hands folded so tightly your knuckles crack. The priest stands at the front, eyes hard as flint, voice steady and unyielding. He's preaching about obedience again, but not the gentle, shepherd-like obedience of a comforting father. No, this is the obedience demanded at sword point. You feel the tension in every hunched back around you. No one dares cough. He warns you all in booming Latin, translated in grim, choppy phrases. Rebellion is sin. Disobedience is damnation. Those who rise against their Lord rise against God himself. You bite the inside of your cheek until you taste blood. Because you know this isn't about saving souls, it's about control. And everyone knows it. Historians still argue whether the church genuinely believed rebellion was heresy or just used the label as a weapon. Some say it was theological necessity. Order was divinely ordained. Others see it as cynical politics, giving lords permission to crush dissent in holy packaging. You suspect it was both. You look at the crucifix on the wall, wonder if Christ would have collected tithes at sword point. You doubt it. But you don't say that. You want to live. The priest speaks of heretics, spitting the word like poison. He warns that rebels spread lies against God's order, that they tempt others with false promises of freedom. You see heads nod. Some believe, others just pretend. You don't know which is worse. He says the church must root out heresy to protect the flock. You know what that means. It means inquisitors. It means trials. It means confessions wrung from terrified peasants with threats of damnation or the crack of a whip. You remember last year when the rumor spread that someone in a neighboring village had denied the king's right to rule. Suddenly, that whole village was heretical. Convenient, wasn't it? Want a weird tidbit? Some inquisitors carried their own portable torture tools. So much for loving thy neighbor. You shiver thinking about that. Because you know if the priest says you're a heretic, no one will save you. Your neighbors will turn away. They'll spit in the dirt and say they always thought you were trouble. Because they're afraid. And you don't blame them. You think about the preacher who passed through, shouting about justice and God's anger at the rich. You liked him. But the priest called him a heretic. Said he twisted scripture to deceive the simple. You wanted to argue. You didn't. Because you wanted to see your children grow up. You remember the priest's eyes on you when you shuffled out after Mass. Assessing, judging. He knew who was listening and who wasn't. And he'd report it, not just to the bishop, to the Lord. Because spiritual guidance had an interesting way of aligning with tax collection. Historians still debate how much the church was complicit in feudal exploitation. Some argue it was the moral conscience of society, restraining the worst abuses. Others see it as the ideological backbone that propped up a system built on suffering. You snort quietly, because you know which version you see when the priest blesses the steward's club before he beats someone for unpaid rent. You hear someone mutter that God must be deaf. You glare at them, not because you disagree, but because you're afraid the priest will hear. He warns you again about eternal fire. Says rebellion leads only to ruin and torment. He says the rebels are possessed by Satan. You wonder if Satan collects tithes too. You bite your tongue. Because you're not stupid. You know the church's wrath isn't just spiritual, it's practical. You heard about the village where the priest denounced rebels from the pulpit while soldiers waited outside. They didn't even get to finish Mass. They dragged men out in their Sunday best, tied them up with belts and curtain cords, carted them away. Confession didn't save them. You watch your own priest now. He has the calm of a man who knows he'll never swing from a rope. He talks about charity, but he lives better than any of you, owns a fat goose, gets the first share of harvest tithes. You once joked he had the only real savings account in the village. Your pockets. You didn't tell that one in public. Want another odd bit? Some monasteries charged rent even for burial plots. Death didn't mean the debt collector stopped knocking. You shift on the hard bench, your backside numb. But you don't leave. You can't. Because not showing up marks you as suspect. Missing mass is practically waving a banner that says, "I'm thinking rebellious thoughts." And thinking is the first crime. You look at your neighbors. Some truly believe. Some tremble in terror. Some have given up. You don't know which you are. You tell yourself you're cleverer than to get caught. But the priest's gaze seems to say otherwise. Because he knows. He knows you all sit there fantasizing about fire and freedom, and he hates you for it. Or worse, pities you. Because he knows you'll lose. He offers absolution, but only if you kneel. Only if you obey. He says you must love your enemies, but he doesn't live in a burned-out hut. He doesn't bury hungry children. He doesn't pay the corvée. He holds the key to heaven, or so he claims. You wonder if he's right. You wonder if you even care anymore. Because hell can't be worse than this. You stand when told. You bow when told. You file out in silence. But inside you're screaming. And you know others are too. You see it in their eyes as they shuffle past the holy water, heads bowed. That's what the priest fears most, not heresy, not Satan, but the quiet rage building behind lowered eyes. Because one day someone will stop bowing. One day someone will say, "God doesn't live here anymore." You wake before dawn to the sound of stirring in the next room. Your wife is already up, feeding the fire with careful puffs of breath, coaxing damp kindling into flame. Sparks crackle, lighting the lines in her tired face. You watch her for a moment. Not just the mother of your children. Not just the one who tends the hearth, patches your tunic, cradles crying little ones in the night. She's your partner. And you know, deep down, she's your co-conspirator. Because none of this revolt happens without her. She's the one who heard the rumors first, whispered them to you while you lay side by side, staring at the thatch. She's the one who hid the extra grain from the steward's count. The one who told the children to keep quiet when men planned in the corner of the room. And if it comes to fighting, you know she won't just stand back. Historians still argue about women's roles in peasant revolts. Some claim they were passive victims or just bystanders. Others argue they were just as involved as men, sometimes more so. You know which side you believe, because you've seen her brandish the kitchen knife when soldiers came looking for you. She didn't scream, she didn't beg. She stood there, chin high, daring them to try. They laughed, but they didn't step forward. Not that time. You remember one revolt where women were the first to throw stones. It wasn't strategy, it was fury. Because when the steward dragged away their husbands for unpaid taxes, they didn't wait for permission. Want a weird tidbit? Some chronicles mention women stripping to their shifts, essentially undergarments, to shame soldiers who hesitated to strike naked women. It was both protest and psychological warfare. Your wife heard that story too. She laughed, said she'd do worse. You didn't doubt her. She knows the cost of obedience. She's the one who sees the children's ribs stand out when the tithe is taken. She knows the priest's lectures about obedience don't fill a belly. She remembers every insult, every shove, every sneer from the steward when she went to beg for mercy on a rent she couldn't pay. And you've seen her break, heard her sob when she thought you were asleep, but you've also seen her stand, wipe her face on her sleeve, and get back to work. Because someone has to. You see the other women too. Your daughter, older than her years, helping in the fields. She listens to the men plan at the tavern door, eyes sharp. Your neighbor's widow, who has nothing left to lose, always the first to volunteer to scout the road for soldiers. The old midwife who knows everyone's secrets, passing messages no one suspects. Historians still debate how many women actually fought. Some argue most stayed behind to tend homes and children. Others point to records of women wielding farm tools in battle lines, tending the wounded, even leading small bands. You suspect both are true, because you know revolt needs more than swords. It needs food, information, care. It needs someone to hide the wounded, to lie with a straight face when soldiers come asking questions, to teach the children to keep silent. You remember the meeting in the barn when someone suggested women stay home. Your wife barked a laugh that shut everyone up. Asked who they thought would poison the soldiers' stew if they got too comfortable. That ended the argument. Want another laugh? Someone suggested the women shouldn't fight because they were too emotional. Your wife said, "Good, it'll scare them more." No one argued after that either. You've seen her sharpen a sickle with the same care she gives to slicing bread. You've watched her practice, quietly, when she thought no one was watching. Not for glory, not for pride, for survival. Because she knows if the revolt fails, the punishment won't spare her. They'll take everything. The home, the children, her dignity. She doesn't say that out loud, but you both know it. You see it in her eyes every time the topic comes up. You remember the night you both agreed. If they come for you, she runs with the children. If they catch you, she doesn't beg. She fights, or she flees. But she doesn't kneel, because there's no mercy for rebels' families. You heard about the village where they burned every house and carted women off in chains. The priest blessed them first, of course, because God apparently approves of tidy records and obedient peasants. You don't talk about that much, because you can't promise it won't happen here. But you do plan. She knows where the kids will hide. She knows which path through the woods leads to safety. She knows which neighbors will lie and say they saw her leave. And if it comes to the worst, you know she'll make them pay. Because that's her vow. She doesn't wear armor, doesn't have a sword, but she's as much a soldier as you are. Maybe more. Because when you dream of freedom, you see burning manors and fleeing lords. When she dreams of freedom, she sees the children's bellies full, the fields untrampled, a quiet night where no one fears hoofbeats on the road. You think maybe that's the better dream. She doesn't tell you to stop fighting, but she reminds you why you fight. Historians still argue about whether these revolts failed because they lacked unity. You think they underestimate the women, because they're the glue that holds it all together. The whispered warnings, the hidden supplies, the hands that bind wounds, the rage that never forgets. You hear her stir the pot over the fire. Thin stew tonight. You don't complain, because you know she gave you more than her share. You know she'd give everything, and you wonder if you'd be as brave. You don't tell her that, but you think she knows. She hands you a bowl, eyes meeting yours. Silent understanding. You both know what might come. You both know what you'll do, not for glory, not for revenge, but for the hope that your children won't have to. You take the bowl and you eat, because tomorrow you might fight. But tonight, you share this moment, together. You're crouched with a group of men and women in the tavern's smoky back room. The doors barred, a single guttering candle fighting the dark. Everyone leans in to hear the voice at the center of the huddle. He's not the reeve, not the priest, certainly not the steward. He's just a farmer like you. Except tonight, his voice carries power. You watch his hands slice through the air, calloused fingers punctuating every promise. We won't pay, we won't kneel, we'll drive them out. You feel the hair on your arms rise, because you believe him, or you want to. Historians still argue about these leaders. Were they inspired prophets, cynical opportunists, or just desperate people pushed too far? Some say they exploited anger for their own gain. Others see them as genuine champions of the poor. You suspect the truth is as messy as your barn floor in spring, because you've seen all types. There's the preacher who quotes scripture with fire in his eyes, condemning lords and priests alike for their greed. He calls himself God's messenger. You don't know if he is, but you know he believes it. And that belief is contagious. Want a weird tidbit? Some claimed visions, saints telling them to rise up. Others claimed angels taught them battle tactics. Nothing like heavenly advice on how to swing a pitchfork. Then there's the carter who doesn't talk about God at all. He talks about fairness, about splitting land evenly, about not paying rents to anyone. His language is simple, sharp. He doesn't promise heaven. He promises food. You listen to both, because both speak to something inside you. But you're not blind. You see the gleam in the preacher's eye when people drop coins in his hat. You see the carter counting volunteers like a merchant counting coppers. You know leadership changes people. You remember one man who led the first raid on the steward's storehouse. Quiet, angry, committed. You followed him gladly. He shared the grain evenly. He let others speak at the planning meeting. But when it was over and they won, he sat in the best chair at the tavern, ale spilled down his shirt, demanding respect. Didn't want to fight anymore. Didn't want to plan. Just wanted thanks. And you gave it. Because he was still better than the steward. For now. You know the stories spread about leaders who took everything for themselves. Who became mini-lords the second they had power. Historians love to argue about whether these were real revolutionaries or just bandits with a better slogan. You think they were both, because hunger and rage can make you noble for a day. But power is a hungry thing too. And it doesn't care who it eats. Still, you keep listening. Because what choice do you have? You're not a leader. You're not clever enough for grand plans. You're strong. You can swing a hoe. You can plant. You can kill if you must. But you need someone to tell you where to stand. You remember the meeting when they argued for hours. Preacher or Carter? God's justice or human justice? You watched the tavern's shadows dance on the walls as tempers flared. Someone called the preacher a liar. He quoted scripture back at them, voice quivering. The Carter mocked him, said God hadn't lowered taxes yet. Everyone laughed. Then they stopped laughing. Because it wasn't funny. Because you needed both of them. You needed faith and anger, promise and plan. So you picked both. You remember the day you marched behind them. Preacher at the front, brandishing his battered Bible. Carter with his club resting on one shoulder, counting every face behind him. They didn't like each other, but you followed both. Because they hated the same people you did. Because they promised to burn the records, end the tithes, feed your children. Because they gave you hope. Want another laugh? Some leaders made up fancy titles for themselves. Captain of the Commons. Avenger of the poor. You tried not to roll your eyes, but you also saluted them. Because why not? If a scrap of authority made them brave enough to lead, you'd pretend it mattered. You remember the preacher giving speeches that made you weep. You remember the Carter planning ambushes that actually worked. You remember how both tried to claim credit after. You didn't care. Because you lived another day. Because you ate that night. Because the steward ran away and didn't come back. Historians still debate whether these revolts failed because the leaders couldn't agree. You know they're half right. Arguments cost time. Split loyalties weakened you. But you also know without those leaders, nothing would have happened at all. They gave voice to what you all whispered alone in the dark. They made you believe it wasn't madness to fight. They made you believe you deserved better. You glance around the tavern now. The candle's nearly gone. Voices have lowered to murmurs. But that man at the center still talks, still slices the air with promises. Tomorrow, he says, we strike the granary. Your stomach growls at the thought. You think of your children's thin faces. You nod, not because you trust him, but because you need him. Because someone has to lead, even if they're flawed, even if they're scared, even if they're as broken as you. You listen to his plan, commit it to memory, and you know tomorrow you'll fight. For him, for yourself, for everyone too afraid to lift their head. Because tonight, he's the leader you have. And that's enough. You trudge through the village lane, boots caked in cold mud, a dull ache deep in your back that never goes away. You pause to stretch and stare at the manor on the hill. It's always there, watching, like it owns the land. Because it does. And you're just renting your own survival. You think of all the ways they take from you. Taxes, so many you've lost count. There's the field rent, calculated carefully by the steward who double-checks your yield and always seems to round in his favor. There's the tithe for the church, wholly 10% in theory, but you know Father Guillaume's arithmetic has a way of growing when he's hungry. There's the mill fee, because you're forbidden to grind your own grain. The bakehouse fee, because you can't have your own oven. The corvée labor, days lost from your own fields to repair the Lord's road or dig his new fish pond. You remember the steward listing it all out in his prim, sing-song voice. You owe this for the land, this for the mill, this for the oven, this for the tithe, this for the unpaid labor. He wanted to stuff that ledger down his throat. Historians still argue whether these rents and dues were fair compensation for land and protection. Some see it as an early social contract, fragile but necessary. Others see it as an extortion racket with polite Latin footnotes. You know your opinion, because the protection is more of a threat. Pay or we'll take your livestock. Pay or we'll evict you. Pay or we'll hang you. You remember the look in your wife's eyes the day you had to hand over your last piglet, the one your children named. She didn't cry in front of them, but you heard her at night. Want a weird tidbit? Some places even taxed the number of windows in a hut. More light meant more payment. You guessed darkness was free. You've heard every promise from the manor about fairer taxes. Just one extra levy this season. The king needs men for war. Only until the new granary is built. Only until the road is finished. They say it with such perfect calm, you almost believe it. Until the steward arrives next season with the same demands plus interest. You joke with your neighbors that the only thing you own, free and clear, is your misery. They laugh. Then they don't, because it's true. You remember the time the Lord promised debt forgiveness after a bad harvest. He let you miss a payment, but then charged interest the next year so high you lost half your crop paying it back. Historians still debate whether these lords were monsters or simply trapped in their own financial obligations. Maybe they owed debts to the king. Maybe they were paying for their fancy new tower or a wedding alliance. But none of that mattered to you, because it was your back breaking in the field, your children going hungry, your wife sewing patches over patches. You think of the priest telling you to be grateful you even have land to work, that God rewards patience. You wonder if God has ever tried paying the steward. You think of that time the steward smiled while announcing new taxes because of the Lord's recent expenses. You didn't ask what expenses, but you saw the new tapestries arrive, heard about the banquet, smelled the roast boar from half a mile away. You scraped together barley and turnips and called it a feast. Want another laugh? A neighbor suggested we should start charging the Lord for our hospitality every time his men slept in our barns uninvited. No one thought that was a good idea. Not if you valued your teeth. You wonder how many promises you've heard in your life. Promises of fair rents, promises of royal charters protecting the poor. Promises that the church would advocate for mercy. Promises that if you obeyed, you'd be rewarded in heaven. None of them kept, except maybe the last one. You haven't been to heaven yet, but you're getting closer every day thanks to this lifestyle. Historians love to argue about why peasants rebelled. Some say it was hunger. Others say it was broken promises. You think it was both, because hunger makes you desperate, but betrayal makes you angry. You can swallow hunger if you think next year will be better. But after enough lies, you stop swallowing. You start spitting. You remember the last time you paid, counted every egg, every bushel, handed it over with shaking hands, watched the steward smirk, and something inside you snapped. Not loudly, just a quiet, stubborn refusal to believe anymore. You didn't yell, didn't threaten, but you didn't bow quite as low. You didn't say thank you. You locked eyes with him, and he noticed. That's when you realized you weren't alone, because your neighbor did the same. And the widow on the edge of the village, who used to plead for mercy? She glared. The steward left quickly that day, because promises only work if people believe them. And no one believed anymore. You spit in the dirt, remembering it, because that dirt is yours in all the ways that matter. You break your back for it. You feed your children with it. You bury them in it if they don't make it through the winter. But the Lord says it's his, because a piece of parchment says so, because some long-dead king gave it to his grandfather for killing enough people. Because God apparently approves so long as he gets his tithe. You rub the mud off your hands and look at your hut, leaning, leaky. Yours, for now, until the next tax, until the next broken promise, until you break instead. You head inside, shut the door, and hold your wife's hand, because tomorrow you pay again or you fight. But tonight you hold on to what you can, because no one taxes that. Not yet. You remember when they first said the king would listen. Word spread like wildfire through the villages. A royal messenger, in bright colors that made your mud-caked eyes squint, rode in with proclamations nailed to the church door. It was almost funny how they pretended you could read, but they read it for you in the square. Spoke of mercy, of reform, of lowering taxes, of listening to the just complaints of his loyal subjects. You remember the hush that fell over the crowd. Because it was hope. Raw, painful hope you hadn't felt in years. You glanced at your wife. She didn't smile. She squinted like she'd smelled something off. You wanted to believe. You wanted it badly. Historians still argue whether these royal proclamations were sincere efforts at reform or calculated ploys to buy time. Some say kings were genuinely worried about peasant suffering. Others see cynical rulers trying to keep their thrones from burning under them. You know which one you believe, because the steward read that proclamation too. Then he folded it neatly, put it in his coat, and raised the rent anyway. Said the king didn't mean us, or that the king had no authority here, or that he'd check with the Lord. You saw the priest clear his throat when someone asked if God wanted us to pay less now. He said it was complicated. You bet it was. Want a weird tidbit? Some royal decrees used such flowery language that no one knew what they actually promised. Even lawyers argued over them, probably while billing extra. But you understood one thing. Nothing changed. At least not right away. You heard of villages that sent humble petitions, carefully worded, bowed low, begged. Some actually got an audience. They left their fields behind, scraping together the tolls to travel, sleeping in ditches along the way. By the time they reached the royal court, they looked like beggars, and were treated like it. Some say they were promised everything: low rents, fair justice, punishment for corrupt stewards. They went home grinning, clutching letters with fancy seals. But those seals didn't stop soldiers, didn't stop the Lord's men from laughing, didn't stop the steward from lighting his pipe with those letters, because out here, the king was just a rumor. Historians debate whether kings even could enforce reforms in distant lands. Some say they tried, issuing charters and commissions. Others argue they never meant to, preferring loyal lords over angry peasants. You know your own experience. A royal proclamation nailed to the church door and ignored so hard it rotted off before anything changed. You remember one winter the taxes got so high everyone talked about marching to the castle. Not just the local manor. The actual royal castle. Someone suggested dragging a wagon full of debts and empty grain sacks and dumping it at the king's feet. You laughed, then realized you weren't joking. But you didn't go, because the roads were watched, because there was war somewhere else, and soldiers would take you for conscripts or rebels, because you were starving and had to plant early to have any hope of surviving, because your children needed you. The king knew that. They all knew that you were trapped by your own life. Want another laugh? One year, the royal tax collector showed up to enforce the king's justice, only to demand double what the steward did. He said it was for your own protection. You asked if he'd protect you from hunger. He didn't think that was funny. You paid anyway, because his men had real weapons. You think about all the times the king swore loyalty to God and to his people, swore he'd protect the weak, uphold justice, be a good shepherd. You wonder if shepherds usually eat their flock. You heard of villages that actually rose up, convinced by those royal promises. They burned the manor, ran off the Lord, sent letters saying they would be loyal subjects of the king if only he'd recognize them. Guess what happened next? Soldiers. Fire. Hanging trees so heavy with bodies they creaked in the wind. You don't talk about that much, but you think about it. Especially when you hear someone say, maybe the king will help us. You see the haunted look in your wife's eyes. She's heard it too many times, and she's buried too many to believe it anymore. Historians still debate whether these betrayals radicalized peasants. You don't think it's a debate. It's a certainty. Because nothing makes you want to pick up a torch like realizing no one will save you. Not the priest, not the steward, not the Lord, and sure as hell not the king. You spit in the dirt at the thought, because the dirt is the only thing honest with you. It'll take your sweat, your blood, but it doesn't lie. You think of all the proclamations, the seals, the signatures. Pretty words on expensive parchment, worth less than the rag you wipe your nose with. Your neighbor once used an old royal decree to patch a hole in his roof. Said it leaked anyway. You laughed so hard you cried, because it felt true. You remember when you wanted to believe, when you thought a good king would ride in, sword drawn, chase off the greedy lords. You held on to that story like a child clutching a blanket. Now you're older. Now you know. If you want justice, you'll have to take it, because no one's giving it to you. Least of all the man in the distant castle who signs your suffering like it's just another parchment. You straighten your back, look at the manor on the hill, and promise yourself, no more begging, no more waiting. If you want freedom, you'll make it with your own hands. No seals, no signatures, no royal mercy. Just you. And everyone else who's done believing. You wake before dawn, the cold biting even through your patched blanket. The coals in the hearth are dead, and you listen to the slow breathing of your wife and children, huddled like puppies for warmth. Your stomach growls, not because you're fasting for religion, because you're poor, and you're tired of it. You sit up slowly, knees cracking, and stare at the dirt floor. It's honest dirt. It'll take your sweat, it'll take your blood. But it doesn't lie. You wish you could say the same about your lord, or your priest, or your king. You know what today will bring. More work you don't own, more taxes you can't afford, more threats if you hesitate. And you're not alone. Everyone you know feels it too. That ache, that anger, that fear. Historians still argue about whether peasants were naturally violent or driven to it. Some say they were easily manipulated mobs. Others see them as rational actors pushed past endurance. You know the answer, because you didn't want this. You wanted to live, to farm, to feed your family, to hear laughter at night instead of crying. You didn't want to kill, but you're willing to, because they gave you no choice. You remember every time you tried to pay with nothing, offered eggs, grain, labor you didn't have to spare. Watched the steward write it down anyway. He always had more ink than you had blood. You remember the priest, voice smooth as butter, saying you must bear your cross. You asked if he'd like to carry yours for a change. He didn't laugh. Neither did you. Want a weird tidbit? Some places actually taxed beehives. You laughed when you heard it. Said at least bees could fly away. You can't. You're bound to the land like a mule. Except the mule might get fed better. You remember arguing with your neighbor about rising up. He was older, slower, his back twisted from years of corvée labor. He said it was suicide. Can't beat them, he muttered. You asked what choice you had. He didn't answer. Just stared at the ground. Because there isn't a choice. Not really. You've seen what happens if you don't fight. They take your food, your land, your dignity, your life. Maybe they don't hang you. Maybe they just work you to death. Is that better? You remember that meeting in the barn. Cramped, smoky, men and women pressed shoulder to shoulder. No one spoke for a long time. Because saying it out loud made it real. Finally someone did. We fight. It wasn't a cheer, just a statement, because everyone knew what it meant. Not glory, not heroism, just desperation. Historians still debate whether these revolts were organized or spontaneous, whether peasants even understood what they were doing. You did. You knew exactly. You knew you were risking everything, your home, your family, your soul, if the priest was right. But you did it anyway, because the alternative was to die on your knees. You remember how you sharpened your sickle. Not for harvest. Not this time. You felt the weight of it in your hands. Imagine swinging it at someone's throat. You wanted to vomit. But you didn't. Because you couldn't afford to. You had to be ready. You remember your wife handing you a knife from the kitchen. She didn't cry, didn't plead, just pressed it into your palm. Told you not to miss. You remember your daughter watching you go. Silent. Old eyes and a young face. You turned away before she could see your tears, because you needed her to think you were strong. Want another laugh? Someone joked we should send the steward a polite invitation to surrender. We actually laughed. for a moment. Then we got quiet again because we knew there'd be no surrender. Not from them, and not from us. You think about the first time you actually fought. Not practice, not words. Real fighting. Your heart was a drum in your chest, your mouth dry as old bread. You remember the screaming, the smell of blood, how heavy it felt to swing again and again. You wanted to stop, but you couldn't, because they didn't, because it was them or you. Historians love to ask if peasants were cruel, if they burned, looted, killed. You know the answer. Yes, because cruelty was taught to you, lesson by lesson, rent by rent, blow by blow. You learned it at the steward's boot, at the priest's threats, at the king's indifference. You're not proud of it, but you won't apologize for it, because when the manor burned, you felt something break free inside you. Not joy, not triumph, just relief, like finally breathing after being held underwater too long. You remember the crackle of parchment as debt records turned to ash. You remember the steward's eyes when he realized no one would save him. You didn't cheer. No one did. You just watched. Because it was justice. Ugly, but fair. Historians still debate whether this violence was avoidable. If better lords could have prevented it. If kinder kings might have listened. You don't know. You just know they didn't. And so you picked up what you had. A hoe, a sickle, a kitchen knife. And you fought. Not for land, not for glory, but so your children wouldn't have to. So they might sleep without fear of hoofbeats in the night. So they might call the dirt under their feet theirs. You sit by the dying fire now, watching the last embers glow. Your hands are rough, your back aches, your heart is heavy. But you don't regret it. Because even if you die tomorrow, you know you tried. You didn't just bow. You didn't just pay. You didn't just wait for mercy that never came. You fought. And that has to mean something, even if it costs everything. You lean against the doorframe of your smoky hut, watching the clouds roll low over your fields. It's quiet for once. No shouting, no boots on the road, just the wind moving through the stubbled fields you broke your back to till. You wipe your hands on your tunic. They're cracked, dirty, the nails black with earth. Honest marks of labor. You wonder if anyone will remember what you did here. Not the planting and the harvesting, but the fighting, the refusing, the saying no more. They'll remember, probably. But you're not sure they'll get it right. Because already you hear arguments in the village about why it all happened. And you know that, in time, others will write it down in fancy script, deciding for you what you were thinking. Historians will argue over you like old women at market haggling over fish. Some will say you were greedy, that you didn't want to pay your fair share, that you wanted freedom without responsibility. You laugh at that, because you know what responsibility tastes like. Thin gruel, bent backs, children buried in narrow graves at the edge of the field. You didn't want freedom from responsibility. You wanted freedom from theirs, from paying for their banquets while you starved, from building their roads while your hut fell in, from feeding their soldiers who then stole your last chicken. Historians still argue whether the revolts were about taxes or justice. They can't decide. Some call it purely economic, a reaction to too many dues, too much rent, a bad harvest that broke the camel's back. Others say it was moral, that it was about fairness, about being treated like human beings instead of beasts of burden with opposable thumbs. You know it was both. Because you can endure hunger, but you can't endure being told it's your duty to starve so someone else can feast. You spit in the dirt at the memory. Want a weird tidbit? Some records of revolts barely mention taxes at all. Instead, they list insults as the cause, like the steward's smirk could light a torch all on its own. You believe it, because sometimes it wasn't the hunger that hurt most, it was the contempt. The way they treated you like you weren't really there. Like your suffering was an annoying sound they could ignore. You remember the priest telling you to accept your lot. You tried. Really, you did. You prayed, you bowed, you paid, but you stopped believing that God lived in the manor house, or the church, or the castle. Historians argue about that too. Was religion the cause, or just a cover? Some say revolts were heretical, attacks on God's order. Others argue you used religion to justify rebellion, quoting scripture about justice, freedom, debts forgiven. You remember the preacher who came through, quoting Isaiah until you believed God himself wanted you to fight. You remember the priest calling him a heretic. You think maybe they were both right, because you were heretics to their system, but faithful to your own truth. You think about that when you see the old church, half burned now, the bell fallen in the grass like a giant's tooth. You don't mourn it much, because it wasn't the building that failed you. It was the promise. Historians love to ask if the revolts were planned or spontaneous. You want to laugh, because it was both. You planned in secret. Careful meetings in barns, behind hedges, but it also happened fast. A rumor here, a tax raise there, a steward beaten because he pushed one man too far. And suddenly the whole village was in flames. You didn't plan the rage. That was always there. Want another laugh? The steward once said peasants couldn't organize, called you animals, said animals can't think. You proved him wrong. But you also proved him right about the anger. Because when you snapped, it wasn't polite. You didn't send a letter, you sent fire. Historians debate whether these revolts could have succeeded. Some say no chance, that lords were too strong, kings too quick to crush, church too good at turning neighbor on neighbor with threats of hellfire. Others argue you might have won if you'd united better, if you hadn't split into factions, if your leaders hadn't turned on each other for glory or loot. You nod at that because you saw it happen. The preacher wanting purity, the carter wanting equality, the blacksmith wanting revenge. All good goals, none willing to compromise. You tried to hold them together, but you're not that clever. You were just tired and angry and scared. You didn't want to be a soldier, but you became one anyway, because the real choice wasn't fight or be free. It was fight or keep dying by inches. Historians sometimes ask why you burned manors, why you killed lords, why you hung stewards from trees. You want to ask them back, have you ever buried a child because you couldn't pay rent and buy food? Have you ever watched your wife offer her wedding band to the tax collector for mercy and seen him laugh? Have you ever worked another man's land while your own went to weeds because he demanded your unpaid labor? If not, maybe keep your questions, because you know why. Even if you can't explain it in fancy words. You did it because they left you no choice. Because you wanted them to feel it. The fear, the hunger, the powerlessness. You're not proud of all of it, but you don't apologize, because you didn't start it. They did. With every broken promise, every stolen meal, every lash of the whip, every lie told in God's name. You cross your arms and stare at your fields, quiet now, but you know the rage is there, sleeping, waiting. Historians will keep debating, but you know, it wasn't just taxes, or faith, or insults. It was everything. The whole weight of their world pressing on yours. Until you couldn't breathe. So you fought. Because you had to. Because no one else would save you. Because you were done asking. Because sometimes even the meek have to pick up a torch and burn it all down. You sit on the old stump by your door, watching the smoke drift from your hearth. The air smells like wet earth and charred wood, a reminder of too many burnings, both righteous and cruel. You rub your hands together, knuckles rough as old bark. It's quieter now, not peaceful, just quieter. You look at the fields that once ran with blood and wonder what it was all for. People like to say it changed nothing, that the lords came back, that taxes returned, that the priest still thumped his Bible and demanded obedience. But you know better. Because you remember how they changed, even if they tried to hide it. Historians still argue about whether peasant revolts really reshaped society or just delayed the inevitable. Some say the uprisings failed in the moment. Others see them as cracks in the wall that would eventually bring the whole feudal system down. You see both sides, because you know the lords remembered. You saw it in their eyes, that flicker of fear when they looked at you. When the steward raised the rent next time, he hesitated, checked the mood, watched your hands, because he remembered the last time you sharpened the sickle for something other than harvest. You think that matters, because fear cuts both ways. You remember them rebuilding the manor house, this time with thicker walls, better guards, a new lock on the record room. proof that they learned. Want a weird tidbit? Some places actually kept special fire buckets in the manor hall, labeled for rebellion, not for kitchen accidents. For you. You laughed when you heard that, because it was proof they didn't trust you. And maybe that was the real victory. They never trusted you again. They knew you were dangerous. Historians argue about legal reforms. Some say kings issued charters lowering rents or standardizing dues, direct responses to the threat of rebellion. Others claim those charters were performative, easily ignored by local lords. You remember proclamations nailed to the church door. You remember how fast they rotted. But you also remember the times you refused to pay more. The times the steward accepted less without sending soldiers, because he was counting too. Counting how many of you might rise up. You remember your neighbor saying, "We taught them once, we can teach them again." It wasn't a threat, just a fact. Historians talk about the gradual end of serfdom. They debate whether it was economic shifts, plague killing too many workers, or the cost of suppressing so many little uprisings. You don't claim to know the grand causes. But you know this: when people learn they can say no, they don't unlearn it. You think about the stories you tell your children. Not the pretty ones from the priest about obedient sheep and gentle shepherds. Your stories have torches in them, pitchforks, rage, and also hope. You tell them about burning records, about stealing back your own grain, about shouting down the steward until he turned pale and quiet. You don't lie to them. You tell them people died, that sometimes you killed, that it wasn't noble or clean, but it was necessary. You watch their eyes as they listen, wide, scared, but also lit with something that looks like understanding. Because you don't want them to be obedient. You want them to be ready. Want another laugh? Some of the ballads that spread turned rebels into heroes, saints, even kings in disguise. One version has you leading the revolt with a silver sword blessed by angels. You snorted so hard you choked on ale when you heard it. Your sword was a hoe. Your blessing was your wife handing you the kitchen knife with shaking hands. But you let them sing it, because people need heroes, even if they have dirt under their nails. Historians love those ballads. They dissect them like frogs, argue whether they're propaganda or folk memory. You think they're both, because you know people lie to themselves to sleep at night. You did. But sometimes those lies hold truth at their core. That you didn't accept your lot, that you fought, that you forced them to see you. You look at the old record book in the steward's office now. There's a stain across your name. From the time the page was torn out and stuffed in the fire, he recopied it. But it's not as neat, not as certain. And that stain is a reminder that you burned it once, that you can do it again. Historians still debate what you really wanted. Did you want equality? A fair lord? No lord at all? You think about that sometimes. You know not everyone agreed. Some just wanted lower taxes, some wanted revenge, some wanted freedom with no plan for what came next. You were all those things. You were messy, contradictory, human, and they hate that because it doesn't fit in their books. But you don't care, because your story isn't for them. It's for the child on your lap, for the neighbor who still limps from the steward's club, for the widow who spat in the Reeves' face at the last rent collection, for everyone who remembers. Because memory is its own kind of weapon. You know they'll try to dull it, call you bandits, heretics, ungrateful, say you threaten God's order. You spit in the dirt at that. Because God doesn't starve children, doesn't take the last piglet, doesn't whip a man for picking up fallen branches. You believe in a God who might even have picked up a torch with you. You smile at that thought, because it's not what the priest says, but it's what you need. You stand slowly, joints cracking, your field waits. It's not rich land, it barely feeds you, but it's yours for now, because you paid for it in sweat and blood and rage, and you'll keep paying, but you won't forget. And you'll make sure they don't either. Because history isn't what's written in their books. It's what you remember, what you pass on, what you refuse to let die, even if they bury it under taxes, tithes, and sermons. You pick up your hoe, test its weight, think about the time you used it for something other than farming. smile, and get back to work, because the land remembers too, and so will you, always. You sit on the edge of your field as twilight deepens, torch in hand, watching the last sputters of flame. It's dying slow, red to orange to ember to black, just like everything else. You don't move to light it again, because there's no point. You're tired, not just in your body, though every joint complains, every muscle burns from years of work that never truly paid off, but tired in your heart, in your bones, the part of you that still dares to hope. You watch the wind steal the last wisp of smoke. It curls and fades, and you wonder if that's what all your fighting will become. Just stories, just rumors. Historians still argue whether Revolt accomplished anything lasting. Some claim they forced change. Others say they just showed the futility of peasant anger. They write essays about strategy, leadership, causes. They count bodies on parchment like a harvest tally. You wonder if they ever sat on cold dirt in the dark, clutching a torch for warmth that wouldn't come. You doubt it, because you know there's no glory in this. No victory parade, no statue, just fields, huts, survivors, and memories that scrape at you like thorns. You think of the manor you burned, how the flames lit the night like false dawn, how you felt free for the first time in your life. For one breath, one heartbeat, then it was ashes. And nothing got easier. You still had to plant, still had to pay, even if to someone new. You still went hungry when the rains didn't come. You still buried children when the plague swept through. Because fire doesn't make the soil richer, it just clears the weeds. Want a weird tidbit? In some places they said rebel ghosts haunted the fields they died defending. That you could hear them whisper in the wind at night. You believe it, because you hear them now. Not words. Just that hush. That reminder. That warning. You stand slowly, knees popping. Look over the land you fought for. It's yours. Kind of. You pay less now, most years. The steward is polite when he visits, careful with his words. The priest preaches mercy more often than obedience. The Lord? Well, he stays away. Historians still debate why things changed. Some say it was fear of another revolt. Some say it was the changing economy. You don't care, because you know it wasn't a gift. It was taken, bought in blood. Yours, your neighbors, even your enemies. You think about the men you killed. You don't know their names, but you see their faces at night. They looked as scared as you were, because they were poor too. Just on the other side, hired to protect a system that bled them dry too. Maybe their wives wept when they didn't come home. You feel that weight. No sermon ever lifted it. No charter ever erased it. Want another laugh? Once your daughter asked if you were a hero. You told her no. Heroes wear crowns or carry swords and paintings. You wore mud and rage and the stink of fear. You tell her you were just someone who didn't want to starve politely. She didn't get it then. Maybe she does now. You think about all the promises they made after. Lower rents, fairer courts, rights for tenants. Some kept, some ignored, but never forgotten. Because once you make a promise under threat of fire, you remember it. Even if you pretend you don't. Historians argue if rebellion was justified, you don't. You know it was, but you also know it broke something in you. That part that bowed without question. That part that hoped someone else would save you. It's gone now. And maybe that's good. Maybe that's the gift the fire gave you. But it's not easy, because it means you're responsible now for every seed you plant, for every debt you refuse. For every time the steward comes and you stare him down instead of looking at your feet, it means you don't get to be innocent. Historians sometimes ask why peasants were so violent. You want to answer, because polite requests didn't work, because waiting for mercy didn't work, because paying didn't work. So you burned it. You watched the dark settle over your fields, your field, for now, because nothing is permanent. Not the manor, not the Lord, not you. You wonder what your grandchildren will remember, if they'll see you as brave or cruel or just desperate. You hope they see the truth that you were all three, because that's what it took. Historians will keep debating it. Let them. You have work to do. You lean down, fingers digging into the earth. Cool, real, honest, it'll take your sweat, but it's yours. You tell the wind one last thing, I remember. And you swear you always will. because someone has to. The wind hushes over empty fields, brushing the rough thatch of roofs with gentle insistence. You exhale slow, feeling your muscles release their tight hold on the day. The soil is cooling now, losing the sun's last heat, settling into the quiet promise of night. You close your eyes and let your shoulders sink, feeling every heartbeat slow. In the distance, the echoes of shouts and flames fade to silence, like ripples on water vanishing in the dusk. There's no torch in your hand now, only your own warmth, gentle, steady, irreplaceable. You listen to the soft creak of timbers settling, the low sigh of wind along the lane. Even the anger softens here, even the memories of fear blur at the edges. Because the night does not judge, it only covers you, wraps you, lets you rest. The fields will still be there tomorrow, patient as ever, waiting for your care, waiting for forgiveness. You feel your breath deepen, your hands relax, the raw lines of hardship smoothing in this darkness that asks nothing of you but to sleep. And you promise yourself you will remember. Not the rage, but the lesson. Not the threat, but the promise. That no one owns the land, no one owns you, that you can lie down here on your own terms beneath your own sky. So sink into the hush now. Let the last ember cool, let the wind fade to stillness. Close your eyes and know you are free. Just for tonight. Sleep.